Hey everyone, today we dive into the most sinister psychological experiment ever conducted by the American government. The story of MKUltra, a 20-year program where the CIA systematically destroyed thousands of minds in pursuit of the perfect mind control technique. What really happened during these secret experiments is so disturbing that when Congress finally exposed it in 1975, even hardened politicians couldn't believe the evidence. The real story of MKUltra is stranger than fiction. Respected doctors collaborating with former Nazi scientists, children tortured in prestigious hospitals, and ordinary citizens unknowingly drugged and psychologically shattered, all in the name of national security. So before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Dr. Ewan Cameron adjusted the electrodes on his patient's temples. It was a Tuesday afternoon in 1963 at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, and the woman strapped to the table had walked in 6 months ago, seeking help for postpartum depression. Now she couldn't remember her own name, couldn't recognize her children, couldn't even remember how to use a toilet. This wasn't medical malpractice, this was Tuesday at a psychiatric hospital, secretly funded by the Central Intelligence Agency, where doctors were systematically erasing human minds and rebuilding them from scratch. Welcome to MKUltra, the CIA's 20-year quest to crack the code of human consciousness itself, a program so morally bankrupt that it makes Nazi experiments look restrained by comparison. The story begins not in a sterile laboratory, but in a mahogany-paneled hotel room in New York City, 1953. CIA Director Alan Dulles sits across from Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a brilliant biochemist with a stutter and a limp, who would become America's most notorious architect of mind control. The room is thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of Cold War paranoia. Dulles slides a classified report across the polished table, his face grim in the lamplight. "The Soviets are ahead of us," he explains, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're breaking our agents, turning them into zombies who praise communism with vacant eyes and monotone voices. American prisoners of war are returning from Korea, fundamentally changed, their personalities seemingly rewritten by enemy interrogators using techniques that Western science can't begin to understand." Gottlieb opens the file with trembling hands, studying photographs of hollow-eyed soldiers who no longer seem quite human. These men had been captured as proud American servicemen, but they returned speaking like propaganda robots, their own memories apparently erased and replaced with communist doctrine. The intelligence community is terrified, not just of what the enemy might do to captured Americans, but of what they might already be doing to agents still operating in the field. The fear is palpable in Washington's corridors of power. If the Soviets have mastered mind control, how many American spies might already be compromised without even knowing it? "What do you need?" Gottlieb asks, his scientific curiosity overriding any moral reservations he might have had. His mind is already racing with possibilities, thinking about the chemical compounds that could alter human consciousness, the psychological techniques that could reshape personality. "Everything," Dulles replies without hesitation, leaning forward in his chair. "I want to know how the mind works at its most fundamental level. I want to know how to break it completely and cleanly, and I want to know how to rebuild it exactly the way we want it, like programming a computer with human thoughts and emotions." Within weeks, Gottlieb receives authorization for a project so secret that most CIA personnel don't even know it exists. The budget is unlimited, millions of dollars with no congressional oversight or accounting required. The scope of human experimentation is unrestricted by law, ethics, or international treaty. They call it MKUltra, and it will become the most morally bankrupt program in American intelligence history. A 20-year descent into scientific hell that will destroy thousands of lives and corrupt dozens of respected institutions. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because Gottlieb didn't just want to conduct experiments in CIA facilities hidden away from public view. He had a much more ambitious vision. He wanted to create an entire network of researchers across North America, most of whom wouldn't even know they were working for the agency. His strategy was brilliant in its deception: fund legitimate-seeming research at respected institutions, allowing academic cover to hide the program's true purposes while giving researchers plausible deniability about their participation in illegal human experimentation. His first major recruit was Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, a Scottish-born psychiatrist who seemed like the perfect candidate for this shadow network. Cameron was highly respected in his field, serving as president of both the American and World Psychiatric Associations. He was also ambitious, deeply frustrated by the limitations of conventional psychiatric treatment, and constantly hungry for research funding that would allow him to pursue more radical experimental approaches. Most importantly, he had already shown a willingness to push ethical boundaries in his pursuit of psychiatric breakthroughs. The pitch was elegant in its simplicity when Gottlieb met with Cameron in a discreet Montreal restaurant. "What if we could completely erase traumatic memories?" Gottlieb asked, stirring his coffee as if discussing the weather. "What if we could give patients entirely new personalities, free from the damage of their past experiences, clean slates upon which we could write healthier, more functional identities?" Cameron was immediately hooked, not just by the scientific possibilities, but by the promise of unlimited funding. The CIA would pay for any experiment he wanted to conduct, no questions asked, no ethics committees to navigate, no oversight whatsoever from medical boards or government regulators. The arrangement was perfect for both parties. Cameron would get the resources to pursue his most ambitious theories about psychiatric treatment, while the CIA would get a respected academic conducting cutting-edge research into the malleability of human consciousness. By 1955, Cameron had transformed his facility in Montreal into MKUltra's most productive research center, a place where the boundaries between medical treatment and human experimentation disappeared entirely. Patients arrived at the Allen Memorial Institute, seeking help for common mental health issues: depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, marital problems. They had no idea they were walking into what amounted to a laboratory for psychological torture. Cameron had developed what he called a three-stage process for completely remaking human personality. First came depatterning, designed to break down existing thought patterns and memories. Then psychic driving, which involved implanting new thoughts and behaviors through repetitive conditioning. Finally, rebuilding, where patients would be given entirely new personalities tailored to what Cameron considered psychologically healthy. Let me tell you about Linda McDonald in much more detail, because her story illustrates just how far these experiments went and how completely they destroyed human lives. Linda was a vibrant 25-year-old mother of 5 children who walked into Cameron's facility in 1963, struggling with postpartum depression and hoping to feel like herself again. She was intelligent, creative, and devoted to her family, but the stresses of repeated childbirth and caring for young children had left her feeling overwhelmed and occasionally melancholy. What happened to Linda over the next 6 months represents one of the most thorough destructions of human personality ever documented in medical literature. Cameron subjected her to what he euphemistically called depatterning, 102 electroshock treatments administered over 86 days, each at levels 30 to 40 times stronger than normal therapeutic doses. The electricity coursing through her brain was so intense that it caused seizures, temporary paralysis, and permanent memory damage. Between the electroshock sessions, Linda was kept in a medically induced coma for months at a time, her body sustained by feeding tubes while experimental drugs coursed through her bloodstream. When she was conscious, she was strapped to a bed in a sensory deprivation chamber, unable to see, hear, or feel anything from the outside world. The only stimulation came from speakers placed next to her ears, playing recorded messages designed to rebuild her personality from the ground up. "You are a good wife," the voice repeated over and over in Linda's darkened world. "You love your husband completely and without reservation. You will obey without question or hesitation. You have no thoughts or desires of your own. You exist only to serve your family's needs." The recordings played 16 hours a day for months, drilling these new thoughts into her empty mind like a psychological jackhammer. Cameron called this process psychic driving, and he documented its effects with the clinical detachment of a scientist studying laboratory rats. "Patient has lost all memories of her previous life," he wrote in his notes with obvious satisfaction. "She does not recognize her children or husband. She has regressed to the mental state of a very young child and must be retrained in basic functions, including toilet use, eating with utensils, and elementary speech patterns." Cameron considered this a complete success, proof that human personality could be erased and rewritten like data on a computer disk. When Linda was finally released, she was no longer the woman who had entered the hospital. She couldn't remember learning to read, couldn't recall her wedding day, had no memory of her children's births or early years. She had to be taught how to cook, how to clean, how to interact with her husband and children. The vibrant, independent woman had been replaced by a docile, confused shell who required constant supervision and care. Now, while Cameron was destroying minds in Montreal, Gottlieb was orchestrating a different kind of nightmare across the United States. His weapon of choice was lysergic acid diethylamide, ESSD. The CIA had first learned about this powerful hallucinogen in 1943, when Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann accidentally absorbed some through his skin during laboratory work and experienced history's first documented acid trip. Hofmann had described a terrifying experience of losing all sense of reality, seeing his furniture transform into threatening shapes and feeling his personality dissolve into chaos. If such a tiny amount could cause such profound psychological effects, Gottlieb reasoned, perhaps larger doses could be used to extract information from captured spies or turn enemy agents into unwitting double agents. He became obsessed with LSD's potential as the perfect interrogation drug, something that could break down psychological defenses and make subjects more susceptible to suggestion, and perhaps even allow the implantation of false memories or artificial personalities. But first, they needed to test it extensively on unsuspecting subjects, because voluntary test subjects might be prepared for the drug's effects and therefore provide unreliable data. Enter George White, a former federal narcotics agent who looked like he'd stepped out of a film noir movie, incomplete with fedora, permanent 5 o'clock shadow, and a complete absence of moral scruples. White had spent years working undercover in the criminal underworld, developing contacts with prostitutes, drug dealers, and other marginal characters who operated outside the law's protection. Gottlieb recruited White to run what became known as Operation Midnight Climax, and the name tells you everything you need to know about the operation's ethics and methodology. White rented apartments in San Francisco and New York, furnished them to look like upscale brothels complete with red velvet furniture, dim lighting, and hidden recording equipment. He hired prostitutes to bring unsuspecting clients back to these apartments for what the clients thought would be routine commercial encounters. The drinks were spiked with massive doses of LSD, sometimes 10 to 20 times stronger than what recreational users would consider a heavy dose. White would watch through two-way mirrors as businessmen, sailors, tourists, and ordinary citizens unknowingly experienced terrifying hallucinogenic episodes, while federal agents took detailed notes on their behavior, reactions, and verbal responses. The subjects would find themselves trapped in psychological hell, unable to understand what was happening to them or why reality seemed to be dissolving around them. Some clients became violent, smashing furniture and trying to escape what they perceived as threats that existed only in their drugged minds. Others became catatonic, sitting motionless for hours while their consciousness was battered by waves of artificial psychosis. A few experienced complete personality breakdown, forgetting who they were or how they had arrived in the apartment. White and his team documented it all with scientific detachment, treating human suffering as valuable data to be collected and analyzed. It was fun. White would later write in a letter to Gottlieb, describing these sessions with obvious relish. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest? His enthusiasm for the work was matched only by his complete indifference to the psychological damage being inflicted on innocent victims. The casualty list from these experiments is staggering, and what we know today is likely just the tip of the iceberg, since Gottlieb destroyed most of the operational records before the program was exposed. Frank Olson was a 43-year-old biochemist who specialized in developing biological weapons for the CIA. He was attending what he thought was a routine agency retreat in rural Maryland, a chance to relax with colleagues and discuss ongoing research projects in a more informal setting. Dr. Gottlieb had spiked the after-dinner liqueurs with LSD, turning what should have been a pleasant evening among colleagues into the beginning of a psychological nightmare that would end in death. For the next several days, Olson experienced complete paranoia, convinced that his colleagues were plotting against him and that the CIA was going to expose his work in biological weapons research, destroying his career and possibly leading to criminal prosecution. Olson became increasingly agitated and unstable, talking about quitting his job and confessing everything to journalists. His colleagues, realizing that he might become a security risk, arranged for him to be taken to New York for psychiatric evaluation. But the LSD had triggered something deeper and more permanent in Olson's psyche, a complete breakdown of his ability to distinguish between reality and paranoid fantasy. 9 days after being unknowingly drugged, Frank Olson crashed through the window of his hotel room on the 13th floor of the Statler Hotel in Manhattan and plummeted to his death on the street below. The CIA classified Olson's death as suicide and paid his family a settlement, swearing them to secrecy about the circumstances and threatening them with prosecution if they revealed details about his work. But Olson wasn't the only casualty of MKUltra's drug experiments. Tennis player Harold Blower died during an LSD experiment at the New York State Psychiatric Institute, where he had been seeking treatment for depression following his divorce. Blower was given a massive injection of a synthetic mescaline compound and died within hours as his body temperature soared and his cardiovascular system collapsed. Mental patients at facilities across the country were given LSD without consent for months at a time, in their existing psychological problems compounded by artificial psychosis induced by CIA-funded researchers. Federal prisoners in Kentucky were kept on continuous LSD trips for 77 consecutive days, their minds battered by unrelenting hallucinations while researchers studied the long-term effects of prolonged psychedelic exposure. What makes this story even more disturbing is how the program expanded beyond adults to target the most vulnerable members of society, youths, children who had no ability to consent to participation and no understanding of what was being done to them. Dr. Loretta Bender, a respected child psychiatrist at Bellevue Hospital in New York, received MKUltra funding to experiment on children as young as 5 years old. Bender's theory was that schizophrenia could be treated with LSD and electroshock therapy, but her definition of schizophrenia was so broad as to be meaningless. Many of her test subjects weren't even diagnosed with mental illness. They were simply described as difficult, emotionally disturbed, or socially maladjusted. Some were children who had been abandoned by their parents and placed in state custody, making them perfect test subjects since no one would complain about their treatment or demand accountability. Between 1960 and 1962, Bender subjected more than 100 children to her experimental treatments. The children received massive doses of LSD, then were subjected to electroshock therapy, while the drug was still active in their systems. The combination was devastating to developing minds, causing permanent psychological damage that would follow these children into adulthood. Many experienced lasting memory problems, inability to form normal relationships, and recurring psychotic episodes triggered by stress or unexpected stimuli. Some never recovered their ability to hold steady employment or live independently. One survivor, who was treated when she was 12 years old, later testified that she had no memory of her childhood before the hospital. "I don't remember learning to read," she said during congressional hearings decades later. "I don't remember my parents teaching me anything. I don't remember holidays or birthdays or playing with friends. It's like I was born when I was 16 years old and everything before that is just empty darkness." The children's suffering was compounded by the fact that they often didn't understand what had happened to them or why they felt different from other kids. They grew up thinking they were crazy or defective, never knowing that their problems were the result of deliberate torture disguised as medical treatment. But here's what's truly shocking about MKUltra. Its reach extended far beyond CIA facilities and contracted hospitals. Through a network of academic grants and research funding, the program infiltrated universities across the United States and Canada, corrupting some of the most respected institutions of higher learning in North America. At Stanford University, Dr. Leo Hollister conducted LSD experiments on psychiatric patients and prison inmates, testing the drug's effects on everything from creativity to sexual behavior. The subjects were told they were participating in legitimate medical research, never knowing that their treatment was being funded by the CIA for intelligence purposes. At the University of Rochester, patients were injected with radioactive materials to study their effects on brain function and behavior. The subjects were typically poor and minority patients who had little understanding of what was being done to them and no power to refuse participation. At Harvard University, Dr. Henry Murray subjected undergraduate students to brutal psychological experiments designed to break down their personalities and study the effects of extreme stress on mental functioning. Murray's experiments involved subjecting students to intense interrogation, personal attacks on their beliefs and values, and psychological torture designed to create lasting trauma. One of Murray's subjects at Harvard was a young mathematics student named Theodore Kaczynski, who would later become known as the Unabomber. Kaczynski participated in Murray's experiments for 3 years, enduring weekly sessions where his personal beliefs were savagely attacked and his psychological defenses systematically broken down. The connection between his participation in these mind control experiments and his later descent into violence remains a subject of intense speculation among researchers studying the long-term effects of psychological torture. The academics involved often didn't know they were working for the CIA, which maintained elaborate cover stories to hide the agency's involvement. Funding came through front organizations with innocuous names like the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation, and the Human Ecology Fund. These organizations presented themselves as private foundations interested in advancing scientific knowledge for humanitarian purposes. Research proposals were reviewed by committees that included CIA personnel, operating under academic cover, ensuring that only projects relevant to the agency's mind control objectives received funding. The researchers thought they were competing for legitimate academic grants, never realizing they were actually bidding to conduct human experiments for the intelligence community. Gottlieb had created a shadow network of researchers conducting mind control experiments across North America, most of them believing they were advancing legitimate science for the betterment of humanity. The deception was so complete that many researchers didn't learn about their connection to MKUltra until the program was exposed decades later. The international connections make the story even more disturbing and show how MKUltra's influence spread beyond American borders. In Canada, beyond Cameron's work in Montreal, the program funded experiments at facilities across the country. The Canadian government, initially unaware of CIA involvement, provided matching funds for what they believed was cutting-edge psychiatric research that would enhance Canada's reputation in the international scientific community. Canadian patients were subjected to the same brutal treatments as their American counterparts, often with even less oversight since Canada's medical regulations were less developed at the time. Entire families were sometimes enrolled in experiments, with parents and children subjected to coordinated psychological manipulation designed to study the transmission of mental illness across generations. In Britain, MKUltra collaborated with Porton Down, United Kingdom's chemical and biological weapons research facility, while British subjects were exposed to LSD and other experimental drugs, often without their knowledge or consent. Military personnel were told they were participating in tests of protective equipment against chemical weapons, never knowing they were actually being used to study the effects of mind-altering drugs on combat effectiveness. Perhaps most chilling were the program's connections to former Nazi scientists recruited through Operation Paperclip. The United States had recruited dozens of Nazi researchers after World War II, including some who had conducted human experiments in concentration camps. These scientists brought with them not only technical knowledge, but also a complete absence of ethical constraints on human experimentation. Dr. Kurt Blom, who had overseen biological warfare experiments for the Nazi regime, was recruited to advise on MKUltra projects involving disease transmission and biological torture techniques. Hubertus Strughold, who had conducted high-altitude experiments that killed prisoners at Dachau, became a consultant on interrogation techniques involving environmental manipulation and sensory deprivation. The most disturbing figure was Dr. Josef Mengele himself, the infamous Angel of Death from Auschwitz. While Mengele never worked directly for MKUltra, the program's researchers studied his techniques and incorporated some of his methods into their own experiments. The same scientific approaches that had tortured and killed Jewish prisoners were now being refined and applied to American citizens. The moral bankruptcy of this collaboration is staggering, but it gets worse when you consider how enthusiastically American researchers embraced these Nazi techniques. They didn't just reluctantly use information obtained through torture, they actively sought to improve upon it, developing new methods of psychological destruction that were even more effective than what the Nazis had achieved. By the 1960s, MKUltra had metastasized into something far beyond its original defensive scope. What began as a program to understand Soviet mind control techniques had become an offensive operation aimed at developing America's own arsenal of psychological weapons for use against foreign enemies and domestic dissidents. Gottlieb's researchers were exploring every conceivable method of controlling human behavior, from the subtle to the grotesque. They experimented with hypnosis techniques that could make subjects forget they had been hypnotized, creating what amounted to perfect amnesia about covert operations. They developed drugs that could make people more susceptible to suggestion, more likely to reveal secrets under interrogation, more willing to commit acts they would normally find morally abhorrent. They worked on methods for implanting false memories so convincing that subjects would swear under oath that fabricated events had actually occurred. They created techniques for splitting personalities, allowing handlers to access different aspects of a subject's consciousness depending on specific triggers or code words. Most ambitiously, they tried to develop methods for turning ordinary citizens into unwitting assassins who would kill on command and then have no memory of their actions. The scope of these experiments defied belief. Researchers studied the effects of electromagnetic fields on brain function, testing whether radio waves could be used to influence thoughts and emotions from a distance. They experimented with ultrasonic sound waves, investigating whether specific frequencies could induce compliance, aggression, or other desired behavioral changes. They developed sensory deprivation techniques so sophisticated that subjects could be held in complete isolation for months while maintaining their physical health, allowing for extended psychological manipulation without the risk of obvious physical evidence. They created drug combinations that could simulate mental illness so perfectly that even trained psychiatrists couldn't distinguish between genuine psychological disorders and artificially induced symptoms. The paranoia that had birthed MKUltra was now consuming it from within. Researchers began to fear that their own techniques might be used against them by foreign enemies or domestic political opponents. Gottlieb started destroying documents in 1964, worried that the program's secrets might fall into the wrong hands and be used to expose or blackmail intelligence personnel. By 1973, when he retired from the CIA, Gottlieb had burned most of MKUltra's operational files, including detailed records of thousands of experiments conducted over 2 decades. What we know about the program today comes largely from financial records that survived the destruction, along with testimony from survivors and researchers who were willing to break their secrecy oaths. This represents just a fraction of the actual scope of the experiments conducted under MKUltra's umbrella. Now here's where the story takes an unexpected turn that shows how historical accidents can expose even the most carefully hidden secrets. The beginning of the end came from a source that had nothing to do with mind control experiments. A botched burglary at the Watergate Hotel in 1972 that would eventually bring down a president and expose decades of intelligence community abuses. As congressional investigators dug into the Nixon administration's abuses of power, they uncovered connections between the Watergate burglars and various CIA operations. The burglars had been funded through the same financial networks used for covert operations, and their activities were part of a broader pattern of domestic spying and political manipulation that raised serious questions about the intelligence community's respect for constitutional limitations. One thread led to another as investigators followed money trails and interviewed former intelligence personnel. Eventually, they stumbled across references to something called MKUltra in budget documents and personal correspondence between CIA officials. The name meant nothing to the investigators initially, but the amounts of money involved and the secrecy surrounding the program suggested something significant. Senator Frank Church, chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, was initially skeptical when briefed on the program by his staff. Descriptions seemed too outrageous to be true, like something from a conspiracy theorist's fantasy, rather than actual government operations. Mass drugging of unwitting citizens, mind control experiments on children, collaboration with Nazi war criminals. It sounded like the plot of a science fiction movie, not a real program conducted by a democratic government. But as investigators pressed deeper, they uncovered the surviving documents that Gottlieb hadn't managed to destroy. Bank records showing millions of dollars in payments to researchers at universities and hospitals across North America. Invoices for LSD purchases large enough to supply recreational users for decades. Medical records documenting the systematic destruction of human minds in pursuit of behavioral control techniques. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Moreover, as news of the investigation leaked, survivors began coming forward with stories that corroborated the documentary evidence. Former patients at Cameron's facility in Montreal contacted investigators with accounts of psychological torture that matched the clinical descriptions in surviving medical records. The Church Committee hearings in 1975 exposed MKUltra to public scrutiny for the first time, and Americans watched in horror as witnesses testified about the program's atrocities. The hearings revealed not just individual cases of abuse, but a systematic pattern of human experimentation that had corrupted dozens of institutions and destroyed thousands of lives. Dr. Gottlieb himself was called to testify, but he proved to be an elusive witness who seemed to have developed selective amnesia about his own program. He claimed memory problems prevented him from recalling specific details about experiments he had personally authorized. He hid behind claims of national security when pressed about techniques that were still classified. Most disturbingly, he showed no remorse for his actions, maintaining that everything had been justified by the threat of Soviet mind control research. What emerged from the hearings was a picture of a program completely out of control, operating without meaningful oversight or accountability for 2 decades. Hundreds of researchers at dozens of institutions had participated in experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics and human rights. Thousands of unwitting subjects had been drugged, tortured, and psychologically destroyed in the name of national security, with many never learning what had been done to them or why their lives had been ruined. The victims of MKUltra began to come forward in larger numbers as the hearings progressed, sharing stories that were almost too horrific to believe. Survivors of Cameron's experiments in Montreal formed support groups, comparing notes about their shattered memories and ongoing psychological damage. They discovered that their individual traumas were part of a much larger pattern of systematic abuse. Families of patients who had died during the experiments demanded answers and accountability from both the CIA and the medical institutions that had hosted the research. Many had been told for years that their loved ones had died from complications of mental illness or suicide, never knowing that death had resulted from experimental treatments that had no therapeutic purpose. The scope of the program's reach became clear as more and more people realized they had been unwitting test subjects, patients who had received unusual treatments at prestigious hospitals, soldiers who had participated in mysterious medical experiments, college students who had enrolled in psychology studies with unusually high payment rates, all began to understand that they had been part of a vast network of human experimentation. But here's the most disturbing part of the entire story, the aspect that shows how institutional power can shield even the most heinous crimes from accountability. Despite the revelations, despite the congressional hearings, despite the public outrage and media coverage, very few people were held truly accountable for MKUltra's crimes. Dr. Cameron had died in 1967 before the program was exposed, taking his secrets to the grave and escaping any possibility of prosecution for his role in destroying hundreds of lives. Dr. Gottlieb retired quietly from the CIA in 1973 and was never prosecuted for his crimes, despite being the architect of the entire program. He lived comfortably in retirement, occasionally giving interviews where he expressed mild regret while maintaining that his actions had been necessary for national security. Most of the researchers involved simply returned to their academic careers, their participation in the program largely forgotten by their colleagues and institutions. Universities that had hosted MKUltra experiments quietly removed references to the research from their historical records, preferring to forget rather than confront their institutional complicity in human rights violations. The CIA's official response was to express regret while minimizing the program's scope and impact. They claimed that MKUltra was a product of Cold War paranoia, an understandable response to the perceived threat of Soviet mind control techniques. They emphasized that the program had been terminated and that safeguards were now in place to prevent similar abuses, though they provided few details about what these safeguards actually entailed. Agency officials argued that the research had been conducted in a different era, when the threat of nuclear war made extreme measures seem justified. They pointed out that many of the techniques developed under MKUltra had never been operationally deployed, suggesting that the program had been more about defensive research than offensive capability development. But the survivors knew better, and their testimony revealed the lasting impact of the program's crimes. The techniques developed under MKUltra didn't disappear when the program was officially ended. They were refined, repackaged, and deployed in new contexts. The psychological torture methods used at Guantanamo Bay and other detention facilities bore striking similarities to MKUltra techniques, suggesting that the program's legacy lived on in the shadows of American intelligence operations. The story of MKUltra is ultimately a story about the corruption of science in service of power, showing what happens when researchers abandon their ethical obligations in pursuit of knowledge and funding. It's about the willingness of institutions to sacrifice individual human dignity for perceived national security benefits, and the ease with which ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil when that evil is presented as necessary and patriotic. Most importantly, it's about the victims, the thousands of people whose lives were destroyed by scientists who saw them not as human beings deserving of dignity and respect, but as laboratory rats whose suffering was merely data to be collected and analyzed. These victims deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a historical atrocity, but as individuals whose pain contributed to our understanding of human rights and the importance of ethical constraints on scientific research. The legacy of MKUltra continues to influence our world today. reminding us that the pursuit of knowledge must never come at the cost of human dignity, and that the protection of individual rights must always take precedence over claims of national security or scientific progress. In an age of advancing neuroscience and technology, the temptation to manipulate human consciousness for political or military advantage has not disappeared. If anything, it has become more sophisticated and potentially more dangerous than ever before.